This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Auric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas of St. Paul is writer and narrator.
This beautiful example of modern Irish craftsmanship, which you see centered on your screen, tells a remarkable story of the rebirth of art in modern Ireland. Wonders are many, Sophocles told us a long time ago, and none is more wonderful than man. I think we may feel that way after we have gone through this particular number of our series on modern Ireland. Art is man's nature, Philip James Bailey told us, but often in art as in science, many of our accomplishments have come to us by accident. And this is true of the story of glass. And the art of modern Ireland that we're dealing with in this number of our series is the story of Irish glass. Glass is so common, it's been with us so long, and we take it for granted. But it has a romance, a phenomenal story, all its own. And probably, although it is today representative of the highest achievements of man's artistic nature, probably in its beginnings, it was all an accident. At any rate, so far as we know, glass appeared in the form of glass beads about 2,500 years before Christ in Egypt, the country to which we're indebted for so much. But even then, it took, as far as we know, about 1,000 years before glass vessels, bowls or cups or any container, anything of the container nature, took about 1,000 more years before these were produced. And then they were quite small for milady's ointments, her cosmetics, and things of that sort. And then about 600 years before Christ, the Greek islands in the Aegean, Greece itself, Sicily, Italy, wherever there were Greek colonies, we begin to find a plentiful supply of glass vessels. This was particularly true around Alexandria. And these early vessels were pressed out by a mold, a plunging mold, so that the plunger came down on the molten glass and spread it out in the shape of a bowl or of a goblet or other kind of container. And then perhaps through accident, we don't know, but whether it was accident or some inventor's genius, pretty soon it was discovered that perhaps glass clinging to maybe a hollow plunging rod, someone discovered that it could be blown and it would take the shape of flasks and bottles. So we now had a magnificent opportunity for an entirely new venture in glassware. The Romans took this up, learned that handles could be attached, feet could be mounted on the bottom of pieces, and an amazing glass industry developed then throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, it may come as a shock to us to know that the Romans shipped commercially in glassware, just as we do today, that their use of glassware was, on a comparative basis, at least as extensive as ours. And some of the techniques that they used, we seem not to have been able to recover, or we seem not to be able to duplicate. At any rate, you see, it is a very ancient industry, and while we don't have time to recapitulate the whole story, we might remind you that after the fall of the Roman Empire and after the disturbances in the Near East, it was the Arabs who carried forth then the development of glass artistry. And it wasn't until the early Middle Ages that the West began once more to make beautiful glass. And this time, it was Venice that was the center of that glass-making industry. We've all heard of the richly colored glassware of Venice. But actually, the glassware that gave Venice its greatest reputation was a clear, colorless glass. And the Venetians were so terribly proud of this, and they were so prosperous in its manufacture, that first of all they moved the factories to the neighboring island of Murano. We know the term, don't we, Murano glassware today. They moved the factories there to lessen the danger of fire, but then they forbade the workmen or their families to leave that island. They were so jealous of their craftsmanship that they wanted no trade secrets leaking out. It's rather, I suppose, endemic in human nature that we try to buy the secrets of competing firms. At any rate, there were enough people after the Venetian secrets that the Venetians adopted this very, very stringent regulation. And the penalty actually, at least on the books, was the penalty of death. Now, the Venetians couldn't keep their secrets, and their secrets eventually carried over into France. As a matter of fact, nobles bribed glass workers to carry their secrets with them. But they were carried over into France and the valley of the Rhone, and they were carried through the valley of the Rhine up into Germany. And we eventually had Italian glass makers as far north as Sweden, Denmark, and getting over to England. So you see, this just spread. Now, in England, during the Middle Ages, glass was chiefly used for church windows. For other uses of glass, we know comparatively little. But in the 17th century, England, through two influences, through a German influence coming over from the continent and through immigrant Italian craftsmen, England was able to bring these German and Italian influences to bear on her own native production of glass, which up to that time had been rather undistinguished. So that at the end of the 17th century, at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, English glassware became very, very famous. Now this is getting us closer to Ireland, since these are neighboring countries. Ireland knew glass, as did all of these nations, really, as far back as the Bronze Age. But actually, again, it was, as with ancient Egyptian ware, mostly for beads and ornamental work. We can't say that we have anything extremely distinguished about Irish glassware until the 18th century. And then we have a marvelous, marvelous development taking place in Ireland. Ireland suddenly becomes the great center of a magnificent craft in glass. And I'd like to document that statement by reading to you from some authorities on this particular subject. Now this, for instance, is a book by E.M. Elville, published in London and dealing with a history of both English and Irish glass. And he says here on page 60, throughout the long history of glass, it is doubtful whether any single glass house, notice the name for the factory, any single glass house has gained such worldwide distinction as that which functioned at Waterford, Ireland between the years 1783 and 1851. And elsewhere in the same book, he remarks, from the outset, the factory was noted for its variety of ware, its originality of forms and decoration, but above all, for its quality. And at the risk, perhaps, of bringing too many books into this, I should like to give you a brief quotation from a book written by a member of the English Parliament, Mr. J.M. Vauxhall, member of Parliament, and this book was published also in London in 1916. It's a few years older than the one I've just read from. And notice what he has to say about the Waterford glass as a collector's item. Waterford cut glass grows more and more dear to buy. They will soon be selling it as if it were antique silver at so much per ounce. I should hope not, because Waterford glass is possibly the world's heaviest glass. But he continues then, of all cut glass, Waterford was the most beautiful. Its specific gravity was the greatest, and deep cutting could take place without the ware being clumsily heavy to begin with. So this is in support of a statement of mine, which might otherwise seem a bit too exuberant, that the glassware produced from 1783 to 1851 in Ireland, in the city of Waterford, in the southeastern part of the country, became one of the greatest glasses in the world. It was shipped to England, America, and the continent. You notice it began in the year 1783, and the 1780s in Irish history are very, very significant, because this was the first time in centuries that Ireland managed to secure for itself a degree of self-government. And there was an immediate revival in the arts and in the industries of Ireland. And this continued all too briefly, because within a few years, that is 1800, the Act of Union was passed and Ireland and England were amalgamated once more. And the factory failed in 1851. Now, the interesting thing is that Ireland, having recovered its freedom once more in our time, decided to see whether it could manufacture glass of the same quality that had been manufactured in Waterford. So in 1947, isn't this a beautiful symbol then, returning to the same city? In 1947, a pilot scheme was introduced into the city of Waterford. And 5 years later, the pilot scheme having continued for 5 years, 5 years later, industrial production began. And once more, one of the most difficult glasses for you to buy on the market is Waterford glass. It is in such tremendous demand. Only a few weeks ago, visiting the Waterford factory, I had dinner with the English buyer who buys also for several of the large American department stores. And I might say that, in a good-natured sense, he was almost at his wit's end, trying to keep up with the demand that he was bringing for the glassware. Now, I should like to tell you a little bit about the manufacture of this glass and to demonstrate from the plant itself exactly how this is made. It's a fascinating exhibition of the sentence I quoted at the beginning of this particular program. That is, art is man's nature. Man is able, you see, to transform such things as sand, not ordinary seashore sand, it's true, but a special silica quality, finer than sugar. But this is one of the chief ingredients of the glassware known as Waterford glassware. One of the extremely important ingredients is lead oxide. In fact, Waterford crystal glass contains more lead than any glass made. 1/3 of the glass is lead. 1/3 of it is metal. Sand, lead, and potash, heated to 1400 degrees centigrade, that's approximately 2500 degrees Fahrenheit, gives us a molten mass. This furnace is extraordinarily hot, of course. The glass is bubbling in there like soup, the mixture that we mentioned of silica sand and lead oxide and potash. It is drawn from here by these men in their difficult hot job, drawn from that furnace. You see the drawing rod, and then blown. I've never tried it. It looks as though it's a very difficult job. At least this particular man seems to be putting a great deal of effort into it. But the younger men seem to take it more casually. This particular young man is one of the apprentices. We ought to remark, and here you see the interior of the factory, we ought to remark that these teams, the blowing team, for instance, consists of 6 members. And 2 of these are masters. One is the master craftsman, another the master, and 4 apprentices. This is why you will see some of these young men in many of the pictures. Here, the mass of glass is being puffed out, and this in turn will go through many other processes before it is finished. That mass that you saw being puffed out may ultimately form a decanter or a bowl or something of the sort, but it may require a handle or feet or some other decoration. And this is the purpose now of that incandescent blob which you see almost dead center on your screen. That's a white hot bit of glass awaiting this other addition, if you will, to one of the products already being formed. Here you see it again almost at the moment when it will be joined to this particular piece being raised to meet it. Now this particular piece looks as though it's going to be formed into a goblet, and the piece, the incandescent blob which you saw in the center of the screen before, will meet this and be shaped to form the base. Here it is going down, the craftsman's hand comes up and with a pair of iron shears snips off as much of it as he thinks will be necessary. Now note the precise timing. We're dealing here with materials that are red hot, but notice the precision and the timing. This man at a glance must be able to know exactly how much glass he wants and snip it off without any hesitancy. I mentioned before that these men work in a team, and they are paid as a team, not as individuals. The team earns its money according to the number of perfect pieces produced. If the work, when it's inspected, is found not to be perfect, there's no pay for that particular piece. This is a great incentive, of course, for the master craftsmen to be very careful in the supervision of the apprentices. Now you see this piece, having been cut off, has come to rest on the end of the goblet being formed. Here it is being lowered to the place on the board where it will be rolled back and forth, a rapid whirling motion to keep it, of course, from dripping, and also to help shape it when the man applies a wooden shaping tool, which you see here. Now notice how it has been flattened out already. This is being whirled all the time up and down this particular plane. Ultimately, it is completed. You see the base now, which was that blob of a moment or two ago, and has now been fashioned not only into the flat base, but with a little knurl between it and the base of the goblet. Eventually, you have a product, something like this splendid decanter. This decanter was first blown out, whirled around, shaped by wooden tools. Notice the neck there, the shaping that took place, those 3 rings, all of that with wooden tools. I mention wooden tools because iron would scar the glassware. Don't forget that the glassware has a high percentage of lead in it. The use then of any iron tool would scar this particular production. Wood then, the traditional tools are used. Here is that goblet going through now a cutting sequence. Here is a bowl being cut. The purpose, of course, of cutting glass is to have it refract the light and to bring out the brilliance and the sparkle in it. The cutting itself eventually gives us pieces like these for the table, where the light in the room is picked up and bounced back to the viewer. And this is a particular, as I read to you a moment ago, a particularly important part of the process in producing Waterford glass. It takes a deep cut, and it doesn't require a clumsy glass to begin with in order to maintain that cut. Even in the production of articles like this, a globe produced completely in glass, blown out and cut with the continents cut upon it. All of this beautiful work is done really with materials that are everywhere present in nature, but carefully blended and carefully controlled, so that eventually we have a man who can sculpt. This is the process now. This young man is sculpting on glass, not now cutting it. Cutting it before, of course, was cutting a deep pattern in diamonds or hobnails or something of that sort. But here now, you see, this is one of the few machines in the whole Waterford plant. And this simply turns a thin cutting tool, and completely freehand, he rotates the glass to bring out the pattern that he desires. Eventually, you may have something like this, a magnificent piece turned out in tribute to Ronnie Delaney, the great Olympic runner. Here, in a moment of prayerful gratitude, having won the race, he falls to his knees at the conclusion of it and utters a prayer. Many interesting pieces of glass sculpture are done on commission, of course, in the Waterford plant. This particular one, for instance, would probably appeal to most Americans. We can see the eagle on it. And this sculpture was a present from the President of Ireland, Sean T. O'Kelly, to the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. This present, of course, was given a few years ago. There are other pieces that have been sculpted with an American association. This particular vase is another interesting and lovely and also historically revealing example of Waterford sculpture done in our time. This is Commodore John Barry, who is commonly called the father of the American Navy, a man who was born in Ireland and whose achievements are commemorated on this glass. Notice the White House at the base of this vase, and the name of the man above it, James Hoban, who was its designer, another Irish contribution, if you will, to the United States. These several examples of various kinds of sculpture illustrate the last of several techniques employed. You remember we began with blowing, and the blowing team was described to you, and then we proceeded to cutting. The cutting is also done with a team, and the last is individual work, highly skilled sculpture. Now we illustrate another ancient and modern technique in Waterford, the production of chandeliers, with all the suggestion of graceful living and glittering ballrooms that these bring to our minds. The White House, for instance, has an antique chandelier of Waterford glass. So has Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So too Trinity Church in New York City. This is a modern example. It's not one of the antiques, but it's a modern example to be found in the Royal Hibernian Hotel in Dublin. And this particular illustration shows us the presentation by Robert Briscoe, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, the presentation of a fine piece of Waterford glass to the former President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, this has been a slight review of the art of glass, particularly, of course, with its Irish implications. This amazing production, as our sources reminded you, this amazing production in Ireland of a splendid glass, but a glass, of course, which suffered from the political misfortunes of Ireland, and the factory closed down in the middle of the 19th century. But part of that miracle of modern Ireland is to be illustrated even in the history of Irish glass, because in 1947, just a quarter of a century after the rebirth of the Irish state, someone got the idea of the rebirth of Waterford glass. And for 5 years, a very careful pilot scheme was carried out in Waterford. So that now, in this city in southeastern Ireland, a city with a very old history indeed, because it was established by the Danes in their invasions of Ireland, now this section of Ireland has had brought to it not only an artistic triumph in our time, so that Waterford glass once more is one of the most sought-after glasses in the world. Not only that, but it has been reborn as part of the modern miracle, the rebirth of the entire country. That is, here is an industry where none existed before, employing at the moment about 850 people, most of whom are men. That means founders of families. So that you see, we have a combination here of art and economy, of art and political economy, if you will, because this artistic triumph is putting bread and butter on Irish tables, is keeping Irish men at home, so that that ugly running sore of emigration, which had bled Ireland for so long now, is gradually being drained, gradually being healed. And it is through such enterprises as that of Waterford glass that modern Ireland is once more standing proudly on its own feet, conscious of doing something noble, something pleasing, something at the same time that is saving, something that is bringing young men and women up in their own country. And thus, you see, in this Irish diary, we have tried to bring you the relationship between Irish art and Irish economy. We have tried to present you with one more facet of modern Ireland, an Ireland that is growing, expanding, recapturing some of her ancient glory.
If you would like a list of suggested readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.